Hello everyone, welcome to part one of two of our notes on life in the Army. This is part one. We'll have part two on a separate video. And we're just going to talk a little bit in general about kind of what life was like for Civil War soldiers. So first, let's take a look at kind of like who's fighting in this war. So a majority of the soldiers that are fighting in this war are between the ages of 18 and 30. Now, there are people that are older and there are people that are younger. There's actually some documentation of kids as young as like 10 years old fighting in the Civil War. But for the most part, it was a war fought by younger people. 18, 19, 20 is the most common ages for most of the soldiers. Most were farmers by trade, about half actually. Might seem a little bit unusual today, but back then that was the largest grouping of what people did for a living. So it's not really that unusual that almost half of the people fighting in the war would be farmers. There were people that were considered to be professionals like doctors and lawyers and stuff like that, but there just weren't as many of them. Average age was 19 and the median age was about 25. So again, fought mostly by younger people. Because when they enlisted, they had to fill out like a physical form and stuff. We do know a little bit about particulars on like height and weight. The average height of a Civil War soldier was about 5'8", kind of a little bit of surprising, perhaps. Typically, you think of adult males today being a little bit over probably 5'8" as an average. And their average weight was 143 pounds. The average Civil War soldier was about 143 pounds. Now, we're going to talk more about African Americans fighting in the Civil War towards the end of the unit. We're going to talk specifically about a very famous group called the Massachusetts 54th. But at the beginning of the war, African Americans were not allowed to enlist in the fight against the Confederacy. So this is something that Lincoln eventually changes, but at the beginning of the war, African Americans were not allowed to officially join the Army. In total, we have about 2 million men serving for the Union Army and about 1 million men serving for the Confederate Army. When you think about the differences in population, there is a very sizable increase of number of population for the North. So it's not really that much of a discrepancy when you think of like proportionally. But we're talking about 3 million men fighting in the Civil War. Now, you might ask why somebody would join and actually choose to fight in the war. And at this point, it's also important to note that at the beginning of the war, these are what we call enlistments. So people are actually making a choice to enlist in the Army for either the Confederacy or the Union. They're not being drafted at this point. So we're going to talk about the draft later. As the war goes on, gradually there's not enough men that are signing up voluntarily, which is the enlistment part. So they do have something later called conscription, which we commonly call a draft today, where you don't really have a choice. You're just being told by the government that you have to participate in the war as a soldier. But at the beginning, people signed up for this willingly. And, you know, when you think about it today, gosh, this is like the deadliest war that the United States has ever had. Why would somebody sign up for this voluntarily? There's a variety of reasons. Some people signed up for adventure. Some of these people had never really been that far away from their hometown, and it was a chance to go out and see different places of the country and participate in this thing that at least at the beginning seemed to be very exciting. A lot of people didn't think that the war was going to last very long, and it might only take a couple weeks even in some cases, is what they thought. So they wanted to jump in and, you know, get their service in as being a member of fighting in the Army. It was a chance for glory. They could become famous. It might help them later on get better jobs and, you know, people respect them more. Some people just wanted to escape from the everyday life of either working in a factory or working on a farm. Some people saw it as a way to actually get paid. You did get paid a little bit as a soldier, and so some people saw it as a way to actually, like, you know, make a little bit of, you know, a wage, and you would get, you know, fed and that kind of stuff. But probably the biggest reason is that a lot of people felt a sense of loyalty to their state, and people in this time period had almost more loyalty to their state than they did to their country. So like people would go if their state asked them to join up for the Army. Technically, they're fighting for like the Union or the Confederacy, but they kind of identified more with their own state than they did with a country, which is kind of a little bit different probably for us today. Here's a picture of some soldiers outside a tent. You're typically moving quite a bit as a group of men on the go. You're moving from one place to another. A lot of times when we think of Civil War soldiers, we probably think of like the battles they fought in. But in many cases, the battles are just like a fraction, like 1 or 2% of the time. Most of the time is spent doing very like boring, mundane things, setting up a camp, collecting firewood, doing chores. They would do different drills to learn how to march and how to fire the artillery, maybe learn how to fire a cannon, stuff like that. So the actual battle part for many of these men was just a very, very tiny, small fraction of the time that they actually spent doing a lot of other things, which in most cases were probably not all that exciting. Now, as far as uniforms, the war is sometimes called the war between the blue and the gray. This gets a little bit shaky because not everybody on both sides was issued uniforms in the same way. But typically the Union Army, when they were given official federal uniforms, they were blue in color, and the official color of the uniforms for the Confederacy was gray, although in many cases there might not be enough supplies to give men uniforms. There might not be enough sheer cloth and stuff available to make the uniforms. One interesting local note, there is a battle called the Battle of Liberty that's fought just south here of Liberty here, and it was essentially a group of Union soldiers from Iowa that was marching down by the river, and they got ambushed by some Confederate troops. And they just recently did a documentary about that battle, and what they found when they did the research was the Iowa troops were actually wearing gray uniforms as they were down here in Missouri, because that was just the uniform color that they had been given back home when they were in Iowa. And so in that particular case, the Union soldiers were actually wearing the gray. The Confederate soldiers in that particular battle were probably just wearing their own kind of their own clothes and stuff. They didn't actually have a formal uniform at that time period for that particular regiment that was in the Battle of Liberty for the Confederacy. Both sides did have a lot of problems with getting supplies. Camps were often very dirty. Soldiers had poor personal hygiene. Hygiene is a term that we use a lot of times today to think about things like brushing your teeth and taking showers and stuff like that. That might seem like a really trivial type of thing, but in this time period that we're living in right now, obviously, you can see where if you have a lot of people living in one space and they're not doing things like washing their hands and taking care of their personal waste and stuff like that, germs can spread very, very quickly. This is an interesting pie chart here. It shows when you look at both the North and the South, as far as soldiers, the percentage that you had that you had survived the war, which was the vast majority, and then the percentage of people that died from disease, and then the percentage that died from wounds that were actually in battle. So you can tell that most people did survive the war, but you had almost twice the chance of dying from disease that you did of actually dying in a battle. And that was largely because they just really didn't understand how a lot of these things worked with like infections and germs and stuff like that. It's stuff that would be common sense, obviously, today, but without getting super gross, when you think about a battlefield hospital tent, for example, you might have a doctor that's doing amputations on soldiers, and he's using the exact same saw to maybe amputate like 10 people in a row and not ever disinfecting that saw. So like the blood is being mixed and the infection and the germs and stuff, it could be 100-degree day, and all of that stuff, all those germs and all that stuff's just being kind of mixed around. So they just really didn't kind of understand how a lot of this stuff worked. They do make a lot of medical advancements during the Civil War just because they're forced to try so many things quickly. Things that they probably wouldn't try in an actual hospital, but they have to try just because they have, low supplies or they don't have a lot of time and they have to get to a lot of men. So they do try a lot of things that are kind of risky. Some of those things work, some of them do not, but they learn from that. And there's like a big jump in the amount of knowledge that doctors get from actually doing these things in the Civil War. All right, so that's going to be where we stop for part 1. When we come back and do part 2, we're going to talk a little bit about some of the technology of some of the weapons and things that they used during the Civil War. All right, thanks guys.